Hi, and thank you for tuning in to Noir Histoire. I'm Natasha, and in this episode, I'll be discussing Island on Fire. Island on Fire, The Revolt That Ended Slavery in the British Empire by Tom Zoellner recounts Samuel Sharpe's rebellion in Jamaica and how it led to the abolishment of slavery. The book delves into the structure of Jamaica's system of slavery and the experiences of the enslaved. There's an in-depth explanation of Jamaican society with regards to culture, but also the island's economics. I find that as I read more history books, I'm taking a deeper interest in the economic history of different crops and products, as well as explorations of how and why certain decisions were made. Island on Fire is an engrossing read that I highly recommend for the light it sheds on the early economic history of Jamaica. Not really having much in the way of expectations. I briefly looked at reviews and I think it had like 4+ stars, but I didn't really dig into the reviews to see people's views and opinions. What really attracted me to the book and made me add it to my reading list is that it's a book about the abolishment of slavery in Jamaica, and as someone of West Indian descent, of Caribbean descent, as my father is from Jamaica, it immediately piqued my interest. I would certainly say that having gone to school in America, I had some basic knowledge and understanding of American Black history. But a few years ago, when I decided to start this Black history website and YouTube channel and whatnot, I started realizing just how little I knew about American Black history. And diving into it, the more I read, the more I realize just how little I knew. And, the more I read, the more I look for different people to profile, events, the more I learn, the more you realize just how much there is out there to learn. So between doing Black history profiles, reading books, watching movies, I feel like I've learned a bit, but I've only scratched the surface of what's out there. And that's just with regards to the history of Black people in America. I've read books by this point, a few books now, about Black people in England, nonfiction, fiction as well. I've watched quite a few movies and whatnot about Black people in England, TV shows as well. Quite a few books that I've reviewed and read have taken place in various African countries, whether by and or about people in African countries. And so, yet still, not as many books that I've read have taken place in the West Indies and the Caribbean. So this presented an opportunity to read about this part of Caribbean history, particularly Jamaican history. So I jumped at the opportunity because they don't really come around that often. I find that, when I find books about the Caribbean, so maybe books from the 60s or 70s or something like that, you can maybe find the name of the book, find a description, but to actually get a copy is easier said than done. So when this book came along, it immediately sparked my interest. And it's once I started getting into the book, and this was without expectations, which can sometimes be the best way to approach books, in that you have just a very basic idea of what the book's going to be about, no preconceived notions or anything like that. And that was certainly the case here. I think it served me well in starting the book. And so I started this book and I wasn't really sure of what to expect. As a concern for me, whenever I get into reading a book like nonfiction book, is always that if it's not about an individual and it's quite a bit into the past, let's say the 1950s or earlier, I'm always concerned that the book's going to be dry, boring, especially in cases when it's nonfiction. I have a fear that it's going to be very academic with just facts, figures, not a lot of story. But this is actually one of the things that I love about history, and I love about history when it's done right, is that history is pretty much just storytelling, right? You tell the story of a person, event, a place, something along those lines. And I think the mark of a good historian, the mark of someone who writes well about history, is that they can draw people into history, right? What drew me into having an interest in history since childhood was good storytelling. And that's certainly the case here, where you have the story being told about the abolishment of slavery, but it's from a variety of different perspectives. The book is actually broken down into a few parts. The first part really dives into slave society in Africa. Well, slave society in Jamaica, and then prior to that, the method of enslaving people in Africa. Sort of just give you an understanding of what the system of slavery was like, how people were transported from Africa Africa to Jamaica, and then what the society was like there in Jamaica. The second part of the book primarily focuses on rebellions, one of which was Tacky's Rebellion and then later Sharpe's Rebellion, followed by the aftermath and circumstances that led to the abolishment of slavery. So, the laws moving through Parliament, politics, all of these different facets, things regarding the abolishment of slavery. So those are like the three main areas. I like books like this where it's like they discuss significant moments in history, but from a variety of perspectives and through the experiences of individuals, because I find sometimes when you take a topic like this and you don't have people or a person at the center of it, sometimes that's how you end up with like that academic feel, right? That kind of cold, sterile thing where you have a hard time connecting with the text, where it's like it doesn't quite hit in the same way when you're getting a story told to you through the perspective or through the life of an individual or a group of people. And so here, the way that the author puts across the book is that you start off with an understanding of the development of slave society in Jamaica. And through that, you get sort of a brief history of Jamaica, how it was that the British came to wrestle control of the island from the Spanish. And then from there, how they developed this slave society, the determining factors that played a part in who left England to come to Jamaica. And then once they got there, the hows and whys of the manner in which they structured the society. So pretty much what it sounds like, and this is something that I've actually previously read as a kid, and it's something that I'm, that I enjoyed reading about pirates, right? I remember as a kid, I don't remember the exact book, but I read about Port Royal and how pretty much that was like the Sodom and Gomorrah of the day. It sounds like in the Caribbean where you had pirates and all these people and whatnot going about, moving about and carrying on. You then had this earthquake that resulted in this section of the island being submerged, right? Like sinking into the sea. And so it happened that this was the part of the island that was incredibly hedonistic. Now, granted, when I was reading books about pirates as a kid, there was no real mention of slavery and things like that. Like they just focused on the pirates. I don't remember them mentioning anything about there being slaves or slave society or whatnot. And they didn't really delve too into detail about the messiness of the pirates, right? But this book certainly went into detail about just how hedonistic the society was, where pretty much you had these planters, as I think occurred elsewhere, but just that the difference being that on the island of Jamaica, it was more out in the open, where you had heavy drinking going on, slave traders, slave masters, when they drank heavily, rum and punches and other mixtures and things like that, they drank heavily. But in addition to that, and also this is something that I took issue with the author, where in reading the book, he describes the country as being like hedonistic during slavery, especially in the early years, where you had all of these newly arrived people coming into the colony, as would occur in other places, right? And being unfamiliar, like being new to this territory, a lot of the travelers and would-be colonists, they arrived in Jamaica and they would die shortly thereafter from various diseases. And that's certainly discussed. But in the midst of this, kind of last hurrah kind of thing, there was an attitude of living for today. This attitude of trying to really get as much money as quickly as possible and then promptly returning to England before your luck ran out and you died, you picked up some kind of disease or whatever. And so as part of this, it would be this thing where a lot of the people that went to Jamaica, they were looking for this hedonistic lifestyle where they wanted to be able to drink all day, carry on, not really work, command other people around, and pretty much play out their sexual fantasies or, carry out their sexual desires with enslaved people, particularly with enslaved women. And this was the place where they could go and they could be and do whatever they wanted. And especially as the, say the center of the American South, the cash crop was cotton. In Jamaica, it was sugar, right? The production of cane sugar really looms large here because it's part of producing sugar. So it helps to produce rum. It produces a lot of these other things that would be very valuable in England and elsewhere in Europe, generating large amounts of profits for these colonists who came to the island. But what I took issue with was that certainly I understand the hard party and the description of it, as well as kind of this all day drinking, right? This unquenchable thirst for alcohol, for liquor. But what really stood out to me was that it made me uncomfortable, where it's as part of this thing of like these slave masters, overseers, and other people in these roles, where unfortunately as part of their position, them having put themselves in a position of having dominion over the enslaved black people on the island, is that they had what they considered like concubines, women that they would carry out their sexual desires with. Certainly it sounds like some of it might not have been necessarily through force, but at the same time, given the circumstances that a woman or a female doesn't own herself, I don't think that you could truly give consent, right? It's without permission. If it's without the option to say no, I don't think that can count as you then saying yes. And so in reading this part of the book, it made me uncomfortable because the author described it as though the enslaved women were having consensual sexual contact with these slave masters, or at the least that some of them were. But I would think, given the circumstances, it seemed like to be overly simplistic terms, right? I think the situation is more complex than that, where if a person can't pick and choose where they want to be, like, whether they want to stay here in this part of the island, if they want to go to that part of the island, where they want to work, if they want to work, the extent to which they want to work, pretty much you don't have any kind of control over your life. If someone else has control over you to that degree, has more power and authority to make decisions over you, and to decide what's going to happen with you in your life, I don't think you can then describe these situations as being consensual. I don't think you can then describe what's taking place as being sex. I think you would have to then call this thing a thing, which is, it's like, like sexual coercion, right? You're being forced to work in whatever various capacities that might be it like out in the field, cooking or cleaning, as a domestic or something along those lines. If you're being pressed into service in those ways, and you then also have that person or them providing you to their friends for sexual pleasure, I don't think you can then consider those exchanges, those interactions to be consensual, right? And that was like one point within the book that I took issue with. Aside from that, I really enjoyed the insights that were provided into how the slave society functioned in Jamaica, as far as how with government representation functioned in Jamaica and how that related back to England, the economics of it with regards to it. Kind of put me in like the frame of mind of thinking about America. If you think about, let's say, prior to the Civil War, during the Revolutionary War, where you had a great deal of the country's wealth concentrated in the South, where through the production of cotton, these other crops, be it rice and whatnot, that it helped to generate a lot of wealth, a lot of revenue, money. For some of these planter families, this money would perpetuate for generations to come. It would be the foundation of wealth that would go on for generations. And you see that play out here in Jamaica as well, but the difference being that like the crops differ. Whereas in America, it might be cotton, rice, indigo, these types of crops. In Jamaica, it was primarily sugar. So there's an explanation of how the economics surrounding slavery and sugar production worked. I think we all know why it was that people were enslaved and taken to the Caribbean. But I appreciate here that the history didn't just start on the shores of Jamaica. Rather, the author takes it back to Africa and explains how it was that these people ended up being enslaved through trade and other machinations, things like that. How these particular groups of individuals were captured and then sent off to Jamaica. And something that I actually found pretty interesting is that so often, and I think even now in the present, myself, I think it's like, which I think I'm guilty of. There's like some ignorance of Africa in comparison to other parts of the world, where quite often we view Africa as one big landmass, one big country, everyone within is the same. But in understanding culture, history, and things like that, the fact is that it's a collection of several countries. It's a continent, right? It's not one like large country. You have different ethnic groups, different languages, different cultures, and as a result of that, you have drastic differences in these groups of people, where the reality is, unfortunately, some of them sold other people from the continent into slavery. But there's some discussion here about, while these different cultural groups and whatnot existed in Africa, it was actually interesting that the book kind of gave you a little overview of Africa at large, like as far as the different regions and how it came to be that you had this focus and concentration on what would come to be known as the Gold Coast or the Slave Coast. And the process actually of getting people from, let's say, West Western and Central Africa to the coast for them to be stolen away to the Americas. The process of that, how exactly it worked. And then even within that and arriving to Jamaica, at least for some time period, the period when people were being taken to Jamaica from Africa, you had it where you could still kind of trace the different groups, where people could more readily kind of identify the group in Africa that they came from. And certainly there's like some prejudice and stereotypes and things like that at play, but there's discussion of the different ethnic groups that existed in Jamaica. And really some of these names were made up by like Europeans, but they actually refer to specific groups in Africa, right? It's just like the Europeans made their own names. So with this, you have like the Cromarties, which, to think of it, actually, when I heard that word, my ears perked up because my mom is from Guyana while my dad is from Jamaica. But while in Guyana, I'd heard references to the Cromarties, right? It's an ethnic group. It's an African ethnic group. And there's like discussion of Akan people, which I'd also heard of, in Jamaica. And so you have like this discussion of like the Igbo, which I know them as being associated with Nigeria. Now living in Atlanta, where I've met a lot of Nigerians, I've heard about like the Igbos and the Yorubas. But it's interesting to see the connection between, Jamaica and Africa, and then like the other ethnic groups that are mentioned as well. Now, granted, there's some stereotypical beliefs that are held about these various groups. Certainly, I'm sure that there was some nonsense at play here, but it was still interesting to read about these groupings. And in a sense, it kind of reminds me of this thing where so often we lament this lost link back to our history, right? As Black people, we might not be able to, as many of us have spread across the diaspora outside of Africa, we might not be able to trace our ancestry back to a particular African ethnic group or region of Africa, without like DNA testing or something like that. But in reading about history, especially books, right, and reading this book, it kind of helped to shorten those links in the past, where I might not be able to specifically know what ethnic group my ancestors were from, or specifically what part of Africa they were kidnapped from, but I think it kind of helps to narrow the scope a little bit, or at least narrow my understanding to kind of better understand where your people might have come from. Where not like an amalgamation of people under this term of Black people. It's kind of like it's this shared heritage now, but where previously we would have been considered separate and very distinct people. But given this concept of race, right, and these other groupings that are so often about some shared trait from culture, whereas with Black people, it's like your skin culture and having some ancestral roots in Africa is the thing that ties us together, right? So you have this breakdown of the history of pretty much how it was that Black people came to Jamaica, the island societal structure. Like, it really interested me. As the book moves on, you get into the rebellion and then later discussion of the movement to abolish slavery. Those parts of the book are also interesting to me, but I especially like the first part of the book, where you get this history of Jamaica. And this might just be a result of my ignorance, in that thus far I've been able to find a lot more books about Black history in America, about Black history of various individuals, from African nations or even some regions of Africa, a few books here or there about Black people in England, but I haven't been able to find a lot of books about the history of Black people in the Caribbean. And so I'm hoping that reading this book, enjoying this book, especially once I think, I got through the prologue, the author actually mentioned a number of other books about colonialism, the anti-slavery movement, the economics of slavery in the Caribbean, books that have been written by other authors. I found myself pausing and running it back to catch the names of those books and authors, things that I might want to explore for further reading. But with this book here, I'm hoping it'll be like a jumping off point for getting more deeply into Black Caribbean history. Reading books about Black American history, the history of Black people in America, that's cool, but I want to broaden my scope a bit and read more books about the history of let's say within the last 40, 50 years or so, but even more into the past, right? Black people in England, to dive more deeply into learning about the Windrush generation, to dive more deeply into learning about the history of Black people in France, the history of Black people in various African countries, the Caribbean, as well as Canada, and even like Central America. And so in reading this book, I felt like it was a really good jumping off point. It really piqued my interest and made me want to dive more deeply into the topic to kind of give a bit more breadth, to read more about Jamaica and Guyana, as well as Barbados, as my family has ties to those three particular Caribbean countries, but also to read about Black people in Trinidad. I've read a little bit about the revolution in Haiti, but I'd like to read more deeply about it to gain a more thorough understanding about the circumstances and what exactly took place. Reading this book, I felt like it was a good gateway to diving more deeply into the subject about the history of the Black diaspora. And I'm certainly open to books of this nature. The way that the book progresses, it's actually in the order of my favorites, which is that the first part of the book was absolutely my favorite when it was discussing the history of Jamaica, the history of slavery. But as it moved into the second part of the book, discussing rebellions and things like that, I would say that was probably my second favorite part of the book, because it continues on this path of giving you a history of the island, but it does so now through the lives of individuals and with a specific focus on slave uprisings and the reality that so often, which is one of the things that annoys me about history, but it also motivates me to dig more deeply and to read things, to read from different perspectives, because so often you get like this sanitized version of history. You get history, but it's through a filter. It's through the filter of someone's agenda, where, you've read and there's a certain narrative that the author wants to tell you or the author wants to convey. And so with that, it conveys it in a manner in which it tells you about the event or, whatever took place. And so it's like, what I enjoyed about the book here is that you get some explanation of what was going on with the Black people on the island as far as the enslaved and also free Black people. But as well, you get some understanding of like what the white colonists, the priests and whatnot, how all of them factored into the events that took place. The rebellion came up. It's like religion was at play, right? And as I think you could say took place in America as well, where you have kind of like a breakdown of things to simplify into like two camps. Those who use religion to justify, you could break it down by simplifying things into like two camps. Those who use religion to justify or use the Bible to justify the enslavement of Black people, to call for Black people to be obedient to their slave masters, and then those who fell on the other side of the spectrum, where they pointed to the Bible and Scripture to point out to Black people that as people of God, as children of God, that they deserve freedom, that religion could be their salvation, that it could give them strength and motivation to push for freedom, right, and to live lives of dignity. When I say dignity, I don't mean that with any judgment of the enslaved, but rather their condition, right? This thing of, as children of God, having been created by God, they should have had liberty like everyone else, right? But they had the right to fight for their freedom. They had the right to be free, the right to live free as any other human being. And so with that in mind, and it kind of points to this thing that's still a thing to some degree, maybe not as quite as much as it was in the past, where the church and religious people and things like that often played a key role in a lot of these movements with regards to organizing people, but then also with regards to kind of lighting a fire under people, motivating them. I think we saw this to an equal degree during the civil rights movement here in America. And I thought it was pretty interesting to read about these uprisings and rebellions in Jamaica, learning that these various religious people played a role in these uprisings. So it's like, for example, something that struck me, actually a new thing that I learned, which I wasn't aware of. I know that here in America, that as a means of control, there was a concerted effort, a very strong push was made to keep the enslaved people in America uneducated, to the point where it's like, you might face severe punishment as a slave if you were caught reading or writing anything, right? Anyone caught trying to teach a slave how to read or write could find themselves in trouble as well. And so with that in mind, it was actually pretty interesting that here it was in Jamaica, through the church and other machinations, there were circumstances that resulted in quite a bit of the enslaved people learning how to read. And not just that they learned how to read, their masters made it possible for them to learn how to read, right? Literacy in Black people was tolerated, if not encouraged. And so it's like, that was like a new fact for me and something that I found interesting. And so with that, like gaining an understanding of Sharpe's rebellion, as previous to this, I think I'd heard reference to the phrase, but didn't really know the details, right? Didn't really have an understanding of what exactly took place. I had previously read about, Tacky's rebellion, Tacky's uprising, and it was something that I wanted to dig into more deeply to potentially do like a Black history profile. But the book actually dives into Tacky's rebellion, where it sounds actually quite similar to Coffee's rebellion, which took place in Guyana, where an enslaved and con man led a slave revolt in Guyana. So in reading about Tacky's rebellion, it actually sounded quite similar to Cuffy's rebellion in Guyana. Cuffy was an enslaved man who led a revolt in Guyana. But then moving beyond that to Sharpe's rebellion, which the book places a lot more focus on, I felt that was very insightful. Sort of this idea, and I think this can be a summarized explanation of the book, where it's a case of losing the battle, but winning the war, where ultimately Sharpe's rebellion proved unsuccessful in the sense that Sharpe and his co-conspirators, their actions didn't immediately lead to the abolishment of slavery as had occurred in Haiti with the Haitian Revolution. Sharpe and the majority, if not many of his co-conspirators and some other people who were involved ended up being executed or otherwise severely punished for their role in the uprising. But what I thought was really interesting is that the author makes the case here that while their uprising might not have resulted in the immediate abolishment of slavery, this uprising or this rebellion, coupled with the others that were taking place on the island, as well as those that were taking place elsewhere in the colonies, in America, the Haitian Revolution, various uprisings in America, all of these factors came together and resulted in the eventual abolishment of slavery on the island of Jamaica, and then elsewhere throughout the British Commonwealth. And so that's actually pretty insightful, right? So what you have, like some of these differences between these uprisings, where uprisings in America were different because past a certain point in time, or especially once they stopped the importation of slaves into America, and this was part of why there was a time in America where there was a point in time in America where enslaved people outnumbered white people. And so you were starting to get into this thing of like the Irish and Eastern Europeans and these other people, now immigrating to the country. And it was kind of like to balance out these numbers, because obviously you reach a threshold, you reach a point where it's like guns and things like that don't matter when you have people to just keep throwing themselves at you, right? And you're outnumbered. It's like, imagine you're a white planter in Virginia. You're living on a property where your neighbor is however many miles away. You're living on this property where it's you, your wife, your kids maybe, and like 50 to 100 people in your plantation. You're setting yourself up for problems. Now consider that when you take a broader scope and you look at it where it's like however many times the number of Black people in comparison to white people, it's like you're setting yourself up for problems that if they should ever join together and rise up, you're going to have a problem. And so this is what resulted in not the immediate abolishment of slavery, but them halting the importation of slaves because the population ratio was getting too out of whack. So then you look at it where in Haiti, same situation. You have a predominantly Black country where you have far more Black people than you have white or Creoles and these other admixtures. And so when they rise up, sure, you have the military and things like that. But number one, you don't have malaria and yellow fever and things like that killing them to the same degree as the colonists. And I guess there's just simply more of them. And what ultimately made the Haitian Revolution successful is that, number one, they were relatively cut off from other countries. It's but so many miles away from America, from other islands. But the fact is that you're on an island and you have to contend with these people. Any approaching forces, be it a navy, an army, or whatever, they're going to have to land, and to some degree, you're cut off from getting help. You'd have to wait for reinforcements and whatnot. So you're in a difficult position. And it's like, especially for you to be outnumbered, that's a problem. And so what spurred on the Haitian Revolution is that they used violence. That's what I would say arguably brought about the end of slavery in Haiti, right? The immediate end, rather than it being this long, prolonged thing. And then it's like, well, sure, the case is made that you have sort of a blending of the two, right? You had Tacky's rebellion, you had Sharpe's rebellion and whatnot, but you had a more gradual abolishment of slavery. The reason being that it was a comparatively non-violent affair. It seems that, or it's argued here by some, that Sharpe's rebellion was essentially originally planned as being more of a work stoppage than an outright rebellion. Initially, there was no plan for violence or things like that. When the situation got underway, things easily got out of hand. If you think of like the nonviolent movement during the civil rights era, where it became this thing that drew the attention of the nation, drew the attention of the world as Black people were fighting for their civil rights. And it's like you had that at play here in Jamaica as well with Sharpe's rebellion, where for the most part, it was planned to be sort of in line with what became the civil rights movement than that of the Haitian Revolution, right? In that it was intended to be relatively non-violent. As you have former Black people that were killed by the military and militia, and then vice versa. And then in addition to that, you have where there's this fear of this remaining threat that something like this could happen again, that ends up being the catalyst for the eventual abolishment of slavery. Recognition of the fact that the colonists, especially because in this case, unlike in America, where pretty much the people that left from Europe and came to America to establish the colonies, right, they stayed. They settled in America, they established lives there, and by the time of the American Revolutionary War, by the time of the Civil War, they had been in these areas for several generations, whereas in Jamaica, you had a largely absentee owner class. A lot of the people that owned these plantations, they had people working in their stead. They were absentee slave masters. A lot of them were back in England or Great Britain, some were ruling from there. And, you know, not being there, not being present. And so it's like, it's this thing where eventually they realize, and it points back to this uncertainty of trying to be a slave owner in Jamaica, in the sense that, number one, it's mentioned that of the people that would move to Jamaica hoping to make a fortune, quite a number of them would die quickly, right, quite soon after arriving, having contracted some kind of disease. And those who didn't die from disease would end up killing themselves either through drinking too much liquor, carrying on or whatnot, just leading an unhealthy lifestyle, a hedonistic lifestyle. And so it's like there was this thing of just trying to get as much money as possible, as quickly as possible, and then returning to England. So what you would end up having happen is that the slave masters were back in England and the slaves were here in Jamaica. And so it ends up being that for every one overseer, plantation manager, accountant, lawyer, what have you, you would have X number of slaves, right? And so it became this very overwhelming thing where it's like they faced a real threat that if they didn't abolish slavery, if they didn't make some kind of changes to the society, they were going to continue to face the threat of these constant uprisings. Because, and it's something that's less discussed with America, where it's like sometimes you get this impression that the enslaved didn't fight back, that they just kind of accepted their lot. And that's not really at all the case. To some degree, the author here makes, or tries to make the point that, you know, religion was the catalyst that drove a lot of the enslaved to fight for their freedom. I don't necessarily know that I believe that, but I think when you look at it, it's not widely discussed in America, but you had various smaller uprisings and resistances, right? And so it's like when people think about a rebellion or an insurrection or uprising or whatever, they're expecting this thing where it's like, you know, thousands of people revolt, and they're like hundreds or thousands of deaths. But that might not necessarily be the case, right? It doesn't mean that the enslaved didn't fight back. We see that in Jamaica. And it's like with these rebellions increasing in frequency, increasing in ferocity, you know, sounded the death knell for slavery in Jamaica. The third part of the book gets more into politics of Parliament. And it's like, it's fine to read, but that was actually like the least interesting part of the book. Not to say it was bad or it was boring or anything like that, but it's like after 2 sections that got me really engrossed in the book, when it got to the third part and it was talking about Parliament and all this kind of stuff, it's like it was informative, but it didn't resonate with me as much as the first 2 parts of the book. So overall, I think that this is definitely worth checking out. It clocks in at about 10 hours. It's an audiobook, but I listen to it while doing other things like driving, while I'm cooking. And it certainly held my attention right from the very beginning. I was completely engrossed. It's like you have history discussed, you have some explanation of Jamaican society as far as like the culture and things like that, but there's also discussion of the economics. Thanks for tuning in. Show notes are available on the Noir Histoire website by the link in the episode description. If you enjoyed this episode and want more book recommendations, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and check out my book review playlist.